Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today we continue exploring the story of Toan and Tu Diem. A simple day of harvesting corn turns tense when they walk to the market and face a decision that tests their patience, pride and trust in each other. Will they hold on to their hard work or let go at the right moment to move forward together? If you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next videos. The next morning, Toan woke up earlier than usual. The air was still cool and the light had just begun to touch the low rooftops around the house. He stepped into the new kitchen and stood still for a moment before bending down. He placed his hand on the floor. The surface felt dry, no longer sticky like the day before, but when he pressed gently, he could tell the layer underneath was still damp. He tapped one corner lightly with the tip of his shoe, listened to the dull sound, and then stopped. Continuing work now would only damage the floor. Yesterday's effort could be lost entirely. He straightened up and looked around the empty kitchen space. There was no frustration on his face, no impatience. Just a familiar sense of acceptance. Living here had taught him that some things could not be rushed, no matter how much he wanted them to move faster. Tu Diem stepped out behind him. She did not ask anything. She watched his movements, looked at the floor, and understood immediately. She was used to mornings like this, when plans had to change for small but unavoidable reasons. She stood quietly for a moment, then turned back inside to prepare. Toan said they would harvest corn today. The corn had matured. If they waited a few more days, the kernels would become too dry and hard, harder to sell. If they missed today, it would mean losing a harvest. Since the kitchen could not be used yet, they would do other work. Tu Diem nodded. There was nothing more to discuss. Work did not wait for emotions. They prepared simple tools. The knives were sharpened again. Rope was coiled neatly. Small sacks for carrying corn were set aside. They had no vehicle, so everything had to be calculated carefully, based on what their bodies could handle. Before leaving, they ate a quick, light breakfast. No long conversation, only short words about what needed to be done. The path to the cornfield was familiar. Dry earth, uneven in places from old footprints. Wild grass grew along the sides, with a few small rice fields nearby that had already been harvested. They walked steadily, each carrying their tools. Their pace was even, not hurried. When they arrived, the sun was just rising, bright enough to see clearly, but not yet harsh. The cornfield stretched out before them. The leaves were dry, dark green turning yellow, rustling softly when touched. The scent of ripe corn lingered faintly in the air. Toan stepped in first. He chose ears with full kernels, twisted firmly, snapped them cleanly, and placed them into his basket. His movements were practiced, requiring no thought. Tu Diem followed behind him, gathering the corn and tying it into small bundles for easier carrying. The work moved along steadily. No one urged the other. No one complained. The sound of corn leaves brushing together and the knife cutting through dry stalks repeated again and again. Sweat formed slowly, soaking into their clothes, but the air remained manageable. At times, Toan turned back and handed Tu Diem larger ears of corn, telling her to set them aside. She took them, nodded, and placed them in a separate pile. The morning passed quietly. Nothing unusual happened, just work following work. Near noon, they stopped to rest under the shade of a tree. They had harvested a reasonable amount of corn. Not so much that it would be impossible to carry, but enough to require careful planning before taking it to the market. They drank water, wiped sweat from their faces, and looked over what they had gathered. No one mentioned prices yet. The most important thing was getting the corn to the market using their own strength. They began sorting. The best ears, full and even, were placed together. Smaller ones were tied into bundles. Without a vehicle, they had to divide the load carefully. Toan carried a large basket. Tu Diem carried 2 bundles tied with rope, slung over her shoulder. Toan looked at her and asked again if she was okay. She said she could manage. Still, he bent down and adjusted the rope to reduce the pressure on her shoulder. The walk to the market felt longer than the walk to the field. The sun climbed higher. The weight pressed down harder. Tu Diem slowed her pace. At times, she stopped briefly, switched shoulders, took a deep breath, and continued. Toan walked a few steps ahead, but kept turning back to check on her. He asked if she needed to rest. She shook her head. Not because she was not tired, but because resting would not make the load lighter. As they neared the market, the noise grew louder. Voices, footsteps, movement everywhere. The atmosphere was completely different from the quiet cornfield. They found an open corner and set the corn down. Only then did the accumulated fatigue settle into their bodies. People passed by continuously. Some stopped to look at the corn, touched it briefly, then walked away. Others asked for the price, listened, and shook their heads. The offers were lower than what Toan had expected. He did not respond immediately. He stayed silent. One buyer lingered longer. He broke off a kernel, examined the color, then offered a very low price. Too low. Toan refused. The man did not argue and walked away. Tu Diem watched him go, worry beginning to rise inside her. Another buyer came. The price was slightly better but still low. Tu Diem looked at the remaining corn, then at her shoulder, already reddened by the rope. She spoke quietly to Toan, suggesting they sell part of it to reduce the load. Toan did not answer right away. He understood her point, but thinking of the entire morning's effort and the long walk here, selling cheaply felt painful. He wanted to wait. Maybe someone would offer a better price. They were not arguing yet, but the tension between them was beginning to surface. The silence stretched longer than usual. Time moved more slowly as they waited at the market. The sun stood high overhead. The air grew heavier. There were many sellers, but few buyers who stopped for long. Toan sat upright, eyes fixed ahead. Tu Diem sat slightly angled, occasionally rubbing her shoulder, already reddened by the rope. A middle-aged woman stopped. She picked up an ear of corn, broke a kernel, nodded slightly. Toan felt a brief sense of hope, but when she offered her price, he froze. It was lower than all the previous offers. He shook his head. She placed the corn back down and said simply, "Then I won't buy," before walking away. Fatigue showed more clearly on Tu Diem's face, not from hunger or heat, but from pressure. She looked around the market. Other corn sellers were in similar situations. Some sold quickly, others kept waiting. No one spoke loudly, but everyone understood it was a difficult day. Another man approached. He examined the corn carefully, asked a few questions, then offered a slightly better price. Still low. Toan remained silent longer than usual. The man waited, then added, "If you don't sell now, it will be even harder later." The words were not threatening, just factual. Toan still shook his head. When the man left, Tu Diem leaned closer to Toan. She spoke quietly so others would not hear. She suggested selling part of the corn first and keeping the best portion, in case someone later offered a higher price. She kept her words short, focused on what felt safest. Toan turned to look at her. He understood her reasoning, but inside he struggled. The entire morning's work, the long walk to the market, made selling cheaply feel like wasting their effort. He did not respond right away, not because he ignored her, but because he had not yet accepted it. The tension between them grew. No raised voices, but the silence became heavy. Tu Diem bent down to adjust the rope around the corn. Toan stood up, shifted his position, trying to find a spot with less sun. The small accident happened right then. As Toan turned, his foot caught on a nearby basket of corn. He lost his balance slightly and bumped into another pile. One of their bundles fell to the ground. A few ears were crushed, kernels spilling onto the market floor. The sound was not loud, but it drew attention. A few people turned to look. Some shook their heads, others sighed. No one blamed him, but the looks made Toan freeze for a moment. Tu Diem crouched down to pick up the corn. She moved quickly, but her hands trembled slightly. She spoke to Toan in a low, clear voice, telling him to be more careful. Her tone was not harsh, but the worry and fatigue of the day were evident. Toan felt irritated, not at her words, but at himself. He replied briefly, saying the market was crowded and accidents were unavoidable. His voice was firmer than usual. For the first time that day, their tension became visible to others. An elderly woman selling corn at the nearby stall spoke up. Her voice was calm and steady, not taking sides. She said, "Fresh corn is always hard to keep at a good price. You've already carried it here on foot. Holding out for a price and carrying it back would be even harder." The simple statement landed heavily. The surrounding noise faded. Toan looked at the crushed ears of corn. He looked at Tu Diem's shoulders, marked by the rope. In that moment, he realized he had pushed too hard. He sat down, stayed silent for a long while. Then he spoke softly, just loud enough for Tu Diem to hear. He said they should sell it. Sell what remained. Stop holding out. There was no relief, but there was acceptance. They sold the corn when the buyer returned later. The price was lower than hoped, but enough to avoid carrying it back. As the corn was taken away, Tu Diem rubbed her shoulder and let out a long breath. Toan stood still, looking at the empty space where their corn had been. In the afternoon, they left the market. Their shoulders were lighter, but their bodies felt drained. The money in their hands was not much, but it came from their own labor that day. The walk home was quieter. They walked side by side, keeping a comfortable distance. No one spoke at first, not out of anger, but because each was sorting through their thoughts. Back home, Toan sat down and counted the money. Tu Diem washed her hands and changed clothes. The atmosphere was subdued but not heavy. After a while, Toan said he had focused too much on holding the price and forgotten about the strain on their bodies. Tu Diem said she worried too much and spoke too quickly, which might have pressured him. There were no long apologies, just acknowledgement. At the end of the day, they stood in front of the new kitchen. The floor was fully dry now. Toan said they could light the stove and cook their first meal tomorrow. Tu Diem nodded. It had not been an easy day, but they had gone through it. Not by winning or losing, but by choosing to stand together.